Good evening, and welcome back to another night of Greek mythology for sleep. Tonight, we are going to hear the entire story of the Argonauts. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to unwind, to learn something new, or to drift off while traveling through the past, I'm glad you're here. Now, let us begin. The world was already tired by the time Jason drew his first breath. The mountains of Thessaly had seen gods stride across their peaks and had watched titans buried under rock. The sea had tasted the wreckage of ships that never found a poet to mourn them. Trees that once heard the footsteps of Hermes and Apollo now listened to farmers cursing the weather and kings muttering oaths under their wine. This was Greece, before Troy, before Achilles and Odysseus, when the stories that later ages would call ancient were still fresh scars. Somewhere between the known and the forgotten, between the last roars of giants and the first careful words of historians, the sea whispered of a single shining thing, a hide that gleamed like captured sunlight, the golden skin of a ram that had once crossed the sky. The golden fleece did not begin as a prize for Jason. It began as a rescue. Long before any ship named Argo touched the water, there was a woman of cloud named Nephele, and her children, Phrixus and Hele, doomed by the petty cruelty that passes for justice in palaces. A jealous stepmother, a rigged sacrifice. The familiar human recipe for divine intervention. At the last moment, a ram with a coat of pure gold appeared, sent from the gods. It carried the children away from their own blood altar, hooves planting briefly on the air itself before it rose higher, out over the roaring sea. Hele slipped. She fell into the water that would ever after bear her name, the Hellespont, where countless ships would one day pass over the place of her drowning without hearing a sound. Phrixus alone reached the far shore, to a land called Colchis, at the edge of anything a Greek could imagine. There he sacrificed the ram in thanks and hung its fleece in a sacred grove, where a serpent that never slept coiled around the trunk and watched with lidless eyes. The fleece stayed there. Seasons turned, kings were born and buried, and new songs layered themselves over the old. Kings in mainland Greece broke their families for the sake of one more piece of land or one more servant. In the smoky halls on winter nights, storytellers mentioned in passing that somewhere far to the east there hung a pelt of gold guarded by a dragon, and that the man who took it would not only win glory, but the favor of gods. That is the thread that runs underneath this tale. Ambition. Not only the burning desire to prove oneself, but the quieter, more poisonous sort that seeps into families and changes the shape of kingdoms. The voyage of the Argonauts does not start when the ship leaves the shore. It starts in the hearts of people who look at their own kin and see not brothers and cousins, but rivals. Later poets would try to chart it properly. Apollonius of Rhodes wrote his long song of the Argonauts in a library far from the sea, pulling together older stories, temple rumors, and scraps of local pride into something like a continuous voyage. Before him, the crew of the Argo appeared like flashes of lightning in many places. One poet naming this hero, another naming that one, each region insisting that its son had taken an oar on that famous ship. Vase painters covered black clay with scenes of oarsmen, of a prow cleaving the waves. of a woman with unbound hair and a torch standing beside a serpent. Names blur and shift. Some heroes step on board in one telling and vanish in another, but the outline remains. There is a ship, clever and new, with a piece of sacred oak in its prow that can whisper with the voice of Zeus. There are heroes, more of them than any story truly needs, crowding the deck with shining armor and old grudges. There is a mission, dressed as a noble quest, but born from fear and prophecy. And there is a woman who knows more of darkness than any man on that ship, waiting at the far edge of the world. The bards like to say that every great hero of early Greek legend stood at the rail of the Argo at least once. Heracles, already heavy with labors and madness. Orpheus, whose voice could soften stone. The Dioscuri, boxing champion and horse tamer. Some lists leave out Atalanta, the huntress who ran faster than any man. Others put her very deliberately among the crew and let us watch the discomfort ripple through the men as they decide whether there is room on a ship of heroes for a woman who needs no saving. The crew changes with the teller, but the idea remains constant. This was the age when the world gathered its champions for the first time and sent them not to war, but to sea. The gods, of course, watched. They were not distant symbols, but meddling neighbors. Hera, queen of the skies, nursed an old hatred for a certain usurper king who thought himself safe behind mortal guards. Athena looked at the new ship with the quiet pride of a craftswoman admiring a well-shaped tool. Zeus, who had once hurled thunder at Titans, sat back upon his high seat and decided, for the moment, to let mortals play at courage. Others lurked at the edges, interested more in individuals than in the voyage as a whole. Aphrodite, who understands better than anyone that love is a weapon. Hecate, of the crossroads and the moon, and the haunted place between house and wild, who was already listening for the steps of a certain girl in Colchis. If this were a simple tale, this would be enough. A wronged prince, a dangerous quest, a ship of heroes, gods looking on, the golden prize glittering in a foreign grove. The voyage would be hard but clean, monsters slain, tasks completed, a triumphant return, and a kingdom reclaimed. That is how our minds like to arrange the world when we can. Straight lines, clear rewards. This is not that kind of story. The saga of the Argonauts is older than the March on Troy, and it feels older in another way as well. It is a story that knows how easily courage curdles. The first blood spilled on this voyage is not always that of enemies. Hospitality turns to slaughter because a storm and darkness play tricks on human senses. A beautiful boy goes to fetch water and never returns. Pulled down into a pool whose surface looks perfectly calm by the time his companions arrive. A guest friend king will be left on a beach, with the sea cutting off his widow from those who killed him. And the gods will be very quiet about who is to blame. At the center of it all stands Jason, not the strongest of the heroes, not the cleverest, not the most pious, but the one who happens to be standing in the precise spot where family sin, divine spite, and the hunger for power intersect. He will be entrusted with a ship that legends cling to like barnacles, and with the loyalty of men who seem larger than life. He will accept help from a woman whose love has been forced upon her by the dart of a god, and who would, even without that god, have been dangerous to cross. For this is also the story of Medea. Long before she steps into the light of a Greek poem, she has her own history. Princess of Colchis, granddaughter of the sun, priestess of Hecate, mistress of knives and herbs, and words spoken at the right hour of night. Some storytellers make her a girl barely past childhood, all fierce devotion and bewildered rage. Others show us a woman already well acquainted with blood, who understands that escaping the world she was born into will cost more than a voyage. Whatever her age, she is the one who will turn the quest from noble errand to something more like a haunting. The Argo will pass islands of only women, where the air still tastes of murdered husbands. It will visit kings who sit in the dark with their food snatched away by monsters and are grateful to trade prophecies for a little peace. It will scrape through rocks that slam together like the jaws of a god. It will steal from a sacred grove and sail away with a relic that should never have left its tree. The wake of that ship will be full of corpses, and the echoes of its passing will carry on into other stories, into the madness at Corinth, into the long chain of disasters that brings us at last to the burning towers of Troy. Long before the strange ship took shape in the harbor, before a barefoot young man stood in the mud with one sandal lost to the river, there was a house that had already offended the gods. The line of Aeolus was a tree with too many branches and too much lightning in its sap. Aeolus himself, son of Helen, grandson of Deucalion who survived the Great Flood, was one of those early kings who seemed to sit halfway between myth and memory. His children scattered across Greece like sparks from a fire. Some became founders of cities, some became bywords for misfortune. In that age, blood was both a blessing and a curse. The more noble your family, the more ways it could find to devour itself. Cretheus, one of the sons of Aeolus, founded the city of Iolcus on the coast of Thessaly. It was a place of grey stone walls and good harbors, where the hills rolled down to meet the sea in slow, green curves. Fishermen mended their nets on the beach, while in the palace above them, the descendants of Aeolus argued over succession and insult. Cretheus married a woman named Tyro, and on the surface this looked like the usual tale of a king and his queen. Tyro, however, loved someone else. Not a man, but a river. The Enipeus flowed cold and clear through Thessaly, and its god was handsome in the way that only an immortal can be, made of water and light, with a voice like winter runoff over stone. Tyro watched him, spoke to him, begged for his attention, but the river god ignored her. The one who did not ignore her was Poseidon, lord of the sea. The stories say that Poseidon took on the form of the Enipeus and came to Tyro in that disguise. The child of that encounter was not a gentle consequence. Tyro bore twin sons, Peleus and Neleus. She hid them away, either from shame or fear, and they were raised in secret, half royal by their mother and half divine by their father. In Greek myth, children of the sea god tend to arrive with salt in their blood and a tendency to break things, especially other people. Peleus grew up with a temper, like a storm that arrives out of a clear sky. When he became a man, Peleus did what men of his line seemed born to do. He killed. But his choice of victim was not some foreign foe or rival king. It was Sidero, the woman who had mistreated his mother Tyro, a cruel foster figure in some versions. Peleus found her on the grounds of a temple of Hera, the Queen of Heaven. Sidero fled into the sanctuary and clung to the altar. It should have been a place of safety. Hera does not look kindly upon those who shed blood in her sacred precincts. Peleus did it anyway. He cut Sidero down where she knelt, her hands wrapped around the stone of the altar. The blood that soaked the floor did not belong to anyone Hera loved, but the insult was sharp. It was not the killing itself that angered her. Gods were used to mortals solving their problems with blades. It was the refusal to respect sacred space, the deliberate violation of sanctuary. From that moment, Hera remembered the name of Peleus and kept it filed away with a long list of grudges. Cretheus, meanwhile, had his own legitimate sons with Tyro, Aeson, Pheres, and Amython. They grew up as princes of Iolcus, heirs in the proper line. You would expect such a house to fracture into open war. But at first it did not. The tension built in quieter ways. Neleus took himself away to found Pylos, and in some stories later became the father of wise Nestor, that old counselor who appears at Troy. Peleus remained in Thessaly like a stone left in the road. When Cretheus died, the natural expectation was that Aeson would take the throne. Aeson was not particularly famous as a warrior, nor renowned for cunning, but he was the rightful heir. Peleus had other ideas. In most versions of the myth, he seized power through a mixture of force and threat. Some say driving Aeson from the city, others say imprisoning him in the palace. Greek storytellers, who loved family tragedies, did not agree on the exact details. What they did agree on is this: Peleus set himself on the throne of Iolcus and held it with the kind of tight, sleepless grip that only the guilty seem to manage. Aeson did not die at once. A king who slaughters his brother openly gives his enemies a story to repeat over their wine. Peleus was not foolish enough for that. He wrapped his cruelty in a thin cloth of mercy. Aeson was set aside, watched, controlled, but allowed to live under guard. That choice would prove to be the worst mistake Peleus ever made. For while Aeson languished under soft captivity, he took a wife. In most tellings she is unnamed, sometimes called Polymede, sometimes Alcimede, sometimes given other local names. What matters is not the label but the fact that she conceived a child. When the time came to give birth, the palace was full of whispering. The guards who served Peleus knew that a living son of Aeson was a threat. So Aeson and his wife devised a deception. The baby was born alive and wailing. The mother smeared herself with blood and lay still, while the old women attending her went to Peleus with their story. The child was dead, they said. A stillbirth. A sign, perhaps, that the gods did not favor the line of Aeson. Peleus, who had other matters to attend to, accepted this news with a nod and a practiced look of solemn regret. In secret, the child was wrapped in warm cloth and given to a trusted servant. That child was named Jason. The servant carried him out of Iolcus in the dark before dawn and climbed the slopes of Mount Pelion. There, in a cave that smelled of pine resin and animal fur and old smoke, lived Chiron, the wise centaur. Unlike the wild centaurs who crashed drunkenly through other stories, Chiron was a creature of discipline and knowledge. His father was Cronus, his mother the sea nymph Philyra. He had tutored generations of heroes and would go on tutoring long after Jason left his cave. Chiron took the infant without surprise. In some versions, it was Hera who had whispered in his ear beforehand. The gods liked to have their tutors prepared. The centaur cradled the baby in arms that were both human and not, looked into his squalling face, and saw the spark of something that could become either greatness or disaster. He agreed to raise him. Jason grew up among the stones and trees of Pelion, surrounded by the sort of things that never appear in royal ledgers but shape kings all the same. He learned to read the weather by the taste of the wind. He learned to name herbs by their smell and the way their leaves felt under his fingers. He listened to Chiron speak of medicine and music, of the stories of older ages when gods walked openly among men. Other pupils came and went. In later tales, the list of Chiron's students reads like the guest list of a banquet in Olympus. Asclepius, who would become a healer so skilled that he made death itself uneasy. Achilles, not yet born but already present as a story in the future. Actaeon, doomed hunter who would one day see a goddess unclothed and pay for it with his life. Each hero carries a faint mark of that cave, of the wise centaur with his unending patience and quiet melancholy. For Jason, Chiron was father and teacher at once. The boy grew lean and strong, with the kind of strength that comes from climbing ridges and hauling water rather than from polished training yards. Chiron taught him to handle spear and sword, but also to sit still and listen, which is a harder lesson for most young men. He learned the names of the constellations and the tales that lay behind them. He learned that his own ancestors were written in the stars, that the house of Aeolus was not simply a list of names in the palace, but a pattern stretched across the sky for those who knew how to look. All the while, down in Iolcus, Peleus ruled. The city did not fall apart. Taxes were collected, ships were built, sacrifices were made on the proper days. Yet something in the air felt wrong, a constant unease that made servants glance at doorways before they spoke. A king who has taken his throne through blood and fear knows that any shadow might conceal a rival. Peleus began to seek reassurance in the old way, by asking the gods for a glimpse of what lay ahead. He went to Delphi, or sent messengers there. He sacrificed at local shrines, listening to the mutter of priests who claimed to hear Apollo in the rustling of laurel leaves. The answer that came back was not the clear reassurance he wanted. Oracles rarely are. In one often repeated version, the message was simple and sharp. Beware the man who comes to you wearing only one sandal. The words were vivid enough that Peleus remembered them, which was unfortunate for him. If he had been the sort of king who listened only to flatterers, the prophecy might have sunk into the mass of other fears. Instead, he carried it back to Iolcus like a stone in his gut. He watched the harbor and the roads leading into the city, and every time a stranger entered his hall, he glanced at their feet. Jason did not hear about this prophecy. In Chiron's cave, he learned older stories, the kind that come from the first attempts to understand why the world is the way it is. When he asked about his own family, the centaur did not lie, but he did not flood the boy with every bitter detail. He told him that his father had been a king whose throne was taken. He told him that the city of his birth still waited by the sea. He told him that there would come a day when Jason would have to leave the mountain and walk down to claim whatever fate had in mind. That day came when Jason had grown into a man, with a beard on his jaw and scars on his hands. Chiron brought him a cloak, a spear, and a pair of sandals, and stood in the entrance of the cave with him. The morning light broke over the ridge, turning the sea in the distance to a smear of bright metal. "It is time," Chiron said. Jason did not ask time for what. He had been feeling this moment approaching the way an animal senses a storm. Dreams had been tugging at him, full of bronze and shouting, and a face he did not know but recognized as kin. He bowed to Chiron, embraced him, and then walked down the mountain. Behind him, he left the cave that had been his whole world. Ahead lay a city he had never seen, and a family he barely understood. The road to Iolcus crossed the river Anauros, a grey, restless stream that slid over stones as it hurried toward the sea. When Jason reached it, the water was swollen from recent rain. On the bank stood an old woman in tattered clothes, leaning on a staff. Her hair was white, her back bent, and the river before her was clearly too strong for her to cross alone. She called to Jason and asked for his help. He could have walked on. Plenty of people do. Instead, he offered his arm and told her to climb onto his back. Her hands were surprisingly strong as they clutched his shoulders. For a moment, he felt a weight that seemed greater than a single human body, as if he were carrying something older and heavier than age. Then he stepped into the river. The current pushed against his legs, cold and angry. The stones were slick under his feet. Halfway across, one of his sandals slipped from his foot and was carried away downstream, spinning like a piece of leaf litter. Jason did not stop to grab it. He grunted, shifted his grip on the old woman, and fought his way to the opposite bank. Only when he set her down on the grass did he realize that he was standing there barefoot on one side, sandal strapped to the other. The old woman straightened, and in that small motion something changed. It was like watching a curtain lift. The bent back straightened, the wrinkles smoothed, and for a heartbeat the air around them smelled of peacock feathers and storm clouds. Jason blinked. The figure before him was both old and ageless, a presence that made the hair rise on his arms. "Remember this," she said softly. "It is a small thing, but the gods remember small things when men come to them with larger requests." Then she was only an old woman again, with a tired smile, thanking him with the courtesy of a stranger. Jason, who had spent his life in the company of an immortal, knew he had just met another. He did not speak her name aloud. On Pelion, he had been taught that the gods hear their names when spoken, and sometimes answering them is as dangerous as being ignored. He only nodded and continued toward Iolcus, 1 foot bare on the road. In the palace, Peleus sat upon the throne of his brother and tried not to think of that river. When word came that a stranger had arrived, broad-shouldered and sunburned, with a spear in his hand and only one sandal on his feet, something inside the king seemed to drop away. For a moment he smelled not incense and polished wood, but the blood of Sidero on the stones of Hera's altar. He heard again the soft voice of the oracle. Beware the man who comes to you wearing one sandal." The stranger walked into the throne room without bowing. His hair was uncombed from travel, and his cloak hung damp from the river crossing. He looked up at Peleus without fear and introduced himself. "I am Jason, son of Aeson," he said. The name went through the room like a chill draft. Courtiers, who had grown used to muttering only Peleus's name under their breath, remembered that there had been another line of kings once. Aeson's old friends, if any remained, stared at the young man and saw, in the shape of his jaw or the set of his shoulders, some echo of the prince they had lost. Peleus forced himself to smile. Years of rule had taught him how to hide his thoughts, but his fingers tightened on the arms of the throne. Here was the prophecy, standing barefoot on his polished floor. He could not kill Jason in front of witnesses without inviting revolt, nor could he let him live and grow into a rallying point for resentment. So he chose a third path. At a public feast, with wine flowing and the air thick with the smell of roast meat, Peleus lifted his cup and addressed Jason in a voice loud enough for every ear in the hall. "You are young and strong," he said. "You have returned to your father's city like a hero in the old tales. Tell me, Jason, if some god had warned you that a certain man would one day be your ruin, what would you do to that man? If he stood before you now?" Jason did not hesitate. Chiron had taught him to answer riddles as well as wield weapons. He spoke lightly, as if playing along with a game, but his words had teeth. "I would not stain the hall with his blood," he said. "I would send him to fetch some great prize from the ends of the earth, something that no man has ever taken and that all men talk of. If he returns, perhaps the god has changed his mind. If he does not, the god has chosen a different path for my fate." Some of the men at the feast laughed. Others frowned, hearing the sharpness beneath the jest. Peleus did neither. He only smiled. The slow, careful smile of a man who has just been handed exactly the instrument he needed. "Very well then," he said. "You are brave and clearly wise. There is, as it happens, such a prize. In a distant land called Colchis hangs the skin of a ram made of pure gold, guarded by a serpent that never sleeps. Bring me the golden fleece from that far shore, Jason, and I will gladly give you the throne that is yours by right." The hall fell silent. The name of the fleece stirred old stories in the minds of those present. Some crossed themselves in little gestures meant for forgotten gods. Jason felt a shiver, as if the river he had crossed that morning now flowed somewhere beneath the floor. He saw, behind Peleus's smile, the outline of a man who had asked the gods for a way to rid himself of danger and believed he had just found it. Still, in his chest, something that had been sleeping all his life woke up. The boy from the cave on Pelion, who had listened to stories of ancient quests and distant lands, felt those tales shift inside him, changing from legend into map. He lifted his cup. "I will go," he said. "I will bring back your fleece." Far above the palace, hidden in the thickness of a cloud, Hera listened and smiled a colder smile than any mortal king could manage. There was a time when ships were little more than fat-bellied fishing boats that hugged the coast like nervous children clinging to a wall. They crept from headland to headland, never losing sight of land, their hulls thick and slow. Fishermen feared the open sea, and merchants prayed to whatever god happened to be nearest when the wind turned rough. The wide water that lay beyond familiar bays belonged to older things than men, and everyone knew it. The Argo was not meant to be that kind of vessel. The idea of her began the same way many dangerous things begin, as a careless suggestion in a hall full of listening people. Once Peleus had spoken the name of the Golden Fleece and set Jason on his quest, the words took on a life of their own. Men in Iolcus began to repeat them in taverns and marketplaces. A journey to Colchis, beyond the narrow waste of the Hellespont, beyond the grey throat of the Black Sea, to the land where the children of the sun had their palace and a dragon coiled around a treasure. If you say such things often enough, someone eventually decides to make them real. The first step was a ship. Not just any fishing boat patched with tar and prayers, but a vessel that could live on the open sea. Peleus agreed to provide the timber, eager to see Jason gone as quickly as possible. That decision sent men into the high forests with axes on their shoulders and sacks of offerings for the local nymphs. Cutting a tree was never a simple act in those days. Every trunk had a spirit. Every grove had a temper. In the hills they found a man named Argus, a shipwright whose skill had already begun to grow into legend. Some storytellers call him the son of Eristor, others the child of a local craftsman. In one tradition he was taught his trade by Athena herself, that grey-eyed goddess who loved clever hands and clean lines more than incense. Whatever the truth, Argus was not like other carpenters. When he looked at a log, he did not see merely a beam or a plank. He saw where the water would touch, where the waves would bite, how the grain would take the strain of oars and wind. Jason came to him with an idea that must have sounded like a madman's boast, a boat that would not cling to the coast but cut across the open sea and live. A hull long and lean, with enough room for many oars and many men. A prow that could climb waves instead of ducking them. Argus listened, ran his calloused fingers along the bark of a pine, and smiled a slow, thoughtful smile. "We will need more than local oak," he said, "and more than local luck." There are stories that say Athena herself appeared to him that night as he sat alone by the half-drawn plans. She did not come with thunder and trumpets. She came in the quiet way of a thought that suddenly feels like memory. A simple idea. Take a beam from Dodona. Dodona lay far to the north, where an ancient oak grove served as one of the oldest oracles of Zeus. Before Delphi learned to speak in hexameters, Dodona had listened to the world. The priests and priestesses there did not inhale vapors or give polished speeches. They sat beneath the trees and listened to the wind passing through the leaves, the rustling of branches, the creak of trunks, the knock of wood against wood. All these were taken as the breath and voice of Zeus. To cut wood from such a place was dangerous, but this was not a cautious age. A small party went north with gifts and apologies. They did not fell an entire oak. They took only a single great beam, cut with ritual care. The chips gathered and burned as an offering. Even so, some say the tree groaned in a human way when the last cut sank in, as if it knew it was losing a part of itself. That beam came back to Iolcus and was given to Argus, who shaped it into the prow of the new ship. From that day, the Argo had a mind of her own. The beam from Dodona kept a memory of its old life. It could speak in a low, groaning voice when the danger was close. It could whisper warnings in the creak of the hull. No other ship before or since carried such a thing, a piece of an oracle straight into the jaws of the sea. The rest of the Argo was built from Thessalian pine and oak, seasoned and shaped. Argus and his workmen laid the keel on a bed of rolled logs, then raised the ribs, one after another, like the skeleton of some long sea creature that had chosen to live above water for a change. The people of Iolcus watched from the edges of the worksite. Children clambered over piles of shavings. Old fishermen frowned and muttered that the thing was too long, that the sea would snap her in half, that no good could come of teaching men to trust so much wood with their lives. Jason watched as well, but with a different kind of attention. He saw the pattern of it, how Argus measured with string and eye, how the lines of the hull curved in a way that promised speed. He did not understand every detail, but he understood enough to feel that something new was being born on that shore. The Argo took her name from her builder. Some say the word itself came to mean swift, so fast did she cut the water. Others say that meaning came first, and Argus, whose mind moved quickly, was given the name to match. Whichever way the story runs, the result is the same. A ship unlike any other waited on the shore, her hull newly tarred, her oar holes gaping like a second row of dark eyes just above the waterline. A great ship is useless without hands to pull its oars, so the next task fell to Jason. He had to fill this long wooden mouth with teeth. In an older world, a single hero might have set out alone and carved his story on the world with his own sword. This was not that kind of tale. The Argo was meant to be crowded. Greek poets loved catalogues. They loved to recite long strings of names, each one carrying a little spark of local pride. In a time when every valley had its own shrine and every coastline its own story, the voyage of the Argo became a way to tie all these scattered myths together. Jason sent word out across Greece. Some traditions say Hera guided the message, her unseen hand nudging events so that the names she favored would hear the call. However it happened, men began to arrive in Iolcus whose very footsteps seemed to carry the weight of later legends. Heracles came. Of course he did. There was almost no story of that age he did not at least brush with his shadow. He arrived with his lion's skin slung over his shoulders and his club in his hand, the air around him humming with unspent rage. His 12 labors had not yet all been completed. Depending on the teller, he was between tasks, waiting for the next impossible order from Eurystheus. Joining the quest for the Golden Fleece offered him a different kind of burden. Some poets like to point out that the skin he wore on his back, taken from the Nemean lion, and the fleece Jason sought, were both symbols of beasts turned into trophies. Kings and heroes, they would say, are often measured by what they have stripped from the wild. Orpheus came too, from Thrace, with a lyre in his hands that had once belonged to Apollo. His mother was the muse Calliope, patron of epic poetry. When he played, trees leaned in to listen, and stones thought about moving aside to give him easier passage. In the long catalogue of Greek mythology, Orpheus is a figure who stands at the doorway between life and death. But on the Argo, he was also a practical presence. His music would help the rowers keep time. It would quiet storms. It would outsing the voices of monsters. The Dioscuri came from Sparta, the twin sons of Leda. Castor, master of horses, and Polydeuces, unmatched with the fist. They were young then, handsome in the unmarked way of men who have not yet taken the full measure of the world. Their story, which would later involve death and a strange arrangement with Zeus that set them in the sky as alternating stars, had not yet unfolded. On the Argo they fought side by side, binding their fame to Jason's voyage for as long as people told the tale. From the north came Zetes and Calais, the sons of Boreas, the north wind. They had feathers at their shoulders and ankles, sometimes shown in art with full wings sprouting from their backs, sometimes only hinted at. Cold air seemed to follow them, and their tempers were quick and sharp. In later adventures they would use that sky-born speed against monsters who tormented the helpless. On the ship, they represented something new, men who belonged both to earth and to air. Idmon the seer arrived with his eyes already shadowed by knowledge. He was a son of Apollo, and prophecy ran in his veins like wine. When asked why he would risk the voyage, knowing as he did so many endings, he is said to have replied that knowing the shape of your own doom does not free you from walking toward it. It only lets you decide how straight your back will be when you arrive. He joined the crew despite his visions, or perhaps because of them. There were others, many others. Admetus of Pherae, whose wife would one day offer her own life in his place. Meleager, prince of Calydon, whose fate was bound to a log smouldering in a hearth. Telamon and Peleus, who with Heracles would one day take Troy in a forgotten earlier war, and whose sons, Ajax and Achilles, would return to those same walls in a later age. Nauplius, king of Euboea, known for his skill in sailing and in vengeance. Tiphys, the helmsman, whose hands on the steering oar would be as important as any warrior's grip on a spear. Each arrival brought with it a little flurry of comment and gossip. The people of Iolcus watched these men with a mix of awe and suspicion. Through them, the quiet city suddenly found itself at the center of Greek imagination. Bards who would have had no reason to visit its harbor now came hoping to catch a glimpse of the gathering. Later, they would take those stories home and inflate them further. It is no wonder that the list of Argonauts varies from poet to poet. Every region wanted its champion to have taken a seat on those benches. In some tellings, there was a woman among them, Atalanta of Arcadia. She was a huntress raised in the wild, abandoned as an infant, and suckled by a bear before being taken in by hunters. She could run faster than any man. She could shoot an arrow clean through a circle of shields. Her story was one of refusal. She refused marriage, refused to be a prize, refused to pretend that she was anything other than what she was. Some ancient poets leave her off the ship entirely, perhaps uncomfortable with her presence among so many men. Others put her there and let her presence throw the entire venture into relief. It is one thing to speak of a band of brothers, bound by oaths and ambition. It is another to add to that band a woman who stands there with her bow unstrung, listening to their boasts and refuses to be impressed. If she was there, Jason had to make a choice. Some of his companions grumbled that her presence would anger the gods, that a ship on such a quest could not risk offending tradition by taking a woman on board. Jason, who had grown up outside palaces, was perhaps less bound by the strict habits of court. He looked at her and saw not a risk, but an archer who could bring down a charging boar. In one version of the story, he invited her aboard against the opinion of many, a sign that he was willing to take useful help from any quarter. In another, he bowed to pressure and asked her to remain behind, and the story sighs a little around that choice. The ancient sources do not agree, and so the Argo sails through time with two futures, one with Atalanta on her deck, one without. While the heroes gathered, sacrifices were offered to the gods. Hera received special honor, though Jason himself did not fully understand why. It was she who had crossed the river on his back, she who had begun to weave his fate into her own design. Athena was invoked as well, her name spoken over the tools of Argus, her image carved quietly on the inside of the hull where only the crew would see it. The sea god Poseidon also claimed his share. No ship that planned to cross the open waters would ignore him. Bulls were slaughtered, their throats cut, the smoke from their burning fat rising in dark coils to the sky. The day came when there was nothing left to add. The Argo stood ready, her hull gleaming with new pitch, her mast standing tall against the pale sea morning. Oars lay in neat stacks on the sand. The heroes who had answered Jason's call gathered by the water, each carrying their own small history along with their weapons. Some wore armor that had already seen battle. Others wore simple travel clothes, their real legend still folded tight inside their future. Argus walked the length of the hull one last time, his palm against the wood as if testing the skin of a horse before a race. At the prow, the dark beam from Dodona seemed to hum faintly. A resonance felt more in bone than ear. No clear words could be heard, but several men found themselves shivering for no good reason. Jason stood apart for a moment and looked at what had been summoned in his name. He saw Heracles with his lion skin and silent fury, Orpheus tuning his lyre, the Dioscuri laughing together, throwing punches at each other's shoulders, Zetes and Calais arguing in low voices that crackled like winter wind under a door, Idmon staring out at the horizon with the eyes of someone already half elsewhere. He did not feel like their equal. How could he? Each of them carried a kind of fame that glowed even before their great deeds had fully taken shape. Jason was the son of a deposed king, raised in a cave, sent on this voyage as an elegant way to die. But the gods had touched his life, and in that world, that counted for much. He felt Hera's unseen attention on the back of his neck, like the pressure of a hand that could push or support. A priest stepped forward and poured wine on the ground in front of the ship. The libations sank into the sand. The men grasped the ropes that held the Argo in place and heaved. The hull shuddered, then slid down the greased logs with the slow, unstoppable movement of something that has been waiting a long time to begin. The sea foamed around her bow as she kissed the water for the first time. One by one, the Argonauts climbed aboard. They found their places on the benches, set their shields along the rail, laid their spears in reach. Tiphys took his place at the steering oar. Jason walked to the prow and laid his hand upon the dark beam. For a heartbeat, he thought he felt a pulse, as if the ship itself had a heart somewhere under the ribs of its frame. "Argo," he said quietly, "carry us there and back again." The sea did not answer, but a small shift in the water lifted the hull, and that was answer enough. Oars dipped. Orpheus struck the first chord on his lyre, a steady rhythm for the rowers. The harbor of Iolcus began to slide away, its familiar stones shrinking, its people becoming small figures on the shore. Peleus watched from the high wall, his face unreadable from that distance. Hera watched from within a drifting cloud. Athena watched from the high air where birds circle. Even Zeus, who had sworn not to interfere too much, turned his gaze briefly toward the thin wooden spear that was now aimed at the distant coast of Colchis. The Argo moved out into the open water, her bow lifting with each new wave. Behind her, the wake spread in white lines that faded slowly and then were gone, as if the sea were swallowing not just the ship's passage, but the last traces of the world as it had been before men dared this kind of voyage. The first days on the open water felt almost like a festival. The oars rose and fell in a clean rhythm, guided by the steady pluck of Orpheus and the raw, bellowed counts of Heracles. When the seas grew rough, salt spray cooled sunburned faces. The men traded stories over dried meat and figs, tested each other with friendly wrestling on the deck when the weather allowed, and looked ahead to a horizon that promised monsters and glory in equal measure. Jason moved among them, still learning how to wear command. He spoke with Tiphys about currents and winds, with Idmon about favorable and unfavorable omens, with Argus about the small groans and creaks of the hull that might mean trouble or might mean nothing at all. The sea began to teach its real lessons. A loose knot, a frayed rope, a carelessly placed spear that slid and almost broke a foot when the ship lurched. Small things, but small things kill as easily as gods do. For a time, the gods were quiet. Then the Argo came to an island where the wind carried no sound of men. From a distance, Lemnos looked like many other Aegean islands, a low line of hills, terraces carved into slopes for vines and grain, a scattering of white buildings near the harbor, smoke rising from hearth fires. But as the ship drew nearer, something felt wrong. The beach was empty. No fishermen hauled in nets. No children ran along the shore. No men stood waiting with ropes to help bring the ship in. The Argonauts exchanged glances. Heracles frowned and gripped his club a little tighter. The Dioscuri leaned on the rail and scanned the town with the watchful ease of warriors who had seen ambushes in prettier places than this. It was Jason who made the choice. He ordered the oars raised and the sail trimmed, and the Argo glided gently into the harbor. The only sound was the slap of water against the hull and the creak of wood. At last, a thin voice rang out from the quay. "Who are you, who come with so many weapons and no traders' banners?" The voice belonged to a woman. She stood at the end of the pier with a spear in her hand and a cloak thrown back from her shoulders. Behind her, more women gathered, armed as well. The sight was enough to make several of the men on the Argo cross themselves in the habit of their own particular shrines. Lemnos, in those days, had a reputation. It was known as an island sacred to Hephaestus, the god of fire and metal, who fell there when Zeus hurled him from the sky. The forges of Lemnian smiths were said to produce fine bronze tools and weapons. But in this generation, another story had taken root. The women of Lemnos had offended Aphrodite. In some versions, they had neglected her shrines. In others, they had mocked her or boasted that they did not need her. The goddess of love, when slighted, rarely responded with gentle correction. She sent them a curse. Their bodies took on a foul smell that drove their husbands from their beds and into the arms of foreign slave women and captured brides. The insult was not simply personal. It cut at the heart of their standing in their own homes. At last, in rage and humiliation, the women murdered their men, not just husbands, but every male they could find. Brothers, fathers, even boys. The island woke one morning to find itself ruled by its widows and orphans. The smell that had driven the men away vanished, as if Aphrodite were wiping her hands of the whole place. That was the story whispered in Iolcus when Lemnos was mentioned. Jason knew it. Many of the men on the Argo had heard some version of it as well. Now they looked at the women on the quay and saw those tales stepping into the sunlight. The leader of the Lemnian women was Hypsipyle, daughter of the former king Thoas. In some sources, she had spared her father, hiding him in a chest and setting him afloat, unable to slay him outright. In others, she had taken part in the slaughter like the rest. However the truth stood, she now ruled an island with no living man, a queen surrounded by loyal sisters and open graves. Jason called back from the deck, giving his name and lineage, naming his crew, and announcing their quest. When Hypsipyle heard the list of famous heroes, something that might have been awe flickered across her face. The Argonauts, though, also represented danger. An island full of men who had spent weeks at sea, and a city of women who had already killed once. It was a combination that could go very wrong in a great many ways. There was a long pause as Hypsipyle considered. Then she did the thing that had kept Lemnos alive since that night of blood. She chose politics. "Come ashore," she called. "Lay your weapons aside in the temple courtyard. Eat at our tables. Sleep under our roofs. You are welcome, Jason of Iolcus, you and your companions." There was no mention of husbands or brothers, no mention of the missing men, only an invitation wrapped in ritual courtesy. The Argonauts accepted. They had little choice. A ship that lives only on dried meat and stale bread soon becomes a floating coffin. Fresh water and better food were needed, and sailors who refuse a friendly harbor out of pure caution usually end up with nothing but tales of how careful they are. Once ashore, the full strangeness of Lemnos began to show. The fields were tended by women. The workshops were run by women. Women guarded the walls. Women carried jars from the wells. Women kept the shrines. Here and there, Jason saw a boy of 10 or 12, but none older. The air held the usual smells of a town by the sea, smoke and fish and tar, but under it all there was a tight, metallic tang, like old blood on bronze that has been scrubbed but not forgotten. Hypsipyle welcomed Jason to the palace that had belonged to her father. Its halls were clean but lacked the easy mess of male presence. No weapons on hooks, no cloaks discarded on benches. Instead, there were carefully ordered cupboards, spindle whorls, stacks of cloth. The queen herself wore no jewels beyond a simple band on her arm and a dagger at her belt. Her hair was braided up out of her way, not arranged for courtly display. "Lemnos has been punished enough," she told Jason as they sat together over food and wine. "We will not starve for the lack of men. We can farm and work and trade well enough, but children do not grow on trees, and an island without young faces becomes a graveyard with houses instead of tombs." It was a plain statement of fact. She was not begging. She was laying out terms. Around them, the hall filled with laughter and song. The women of Lemnos, who had been living for some time with only each other for company, looked at the Argonauts with frank curiosity. The men, denied the company of women since leaving Iolcus, looked back with a mixture of hunger and admiration and fear. Heracles remained largely apart from the festivities. He ate and drank, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The labors imposed on him had burned into him a sense that pleasure was always temporary. He kept Hylas near him, the boy who acted as his squire, fetching water, tending weapons, moving through the world in that half-proud, half-anxious way of a youth attached to a famous name. Jason did not stay apart. He and Hypsipyle found themselves drawn together. They walked along the walls at dusk, looking out at the sea. They spoke of rule, of what it meant to hold power without a father or older brother to lean on. Jason saw in her not only a woman with whom he could share a bed, but a mirror of what he might someday become if he lived through this voyage and took the throne of Iolcus, a ruler whose claim rested on a fragile pile of decisions and bloody compromises. The stories say they became lovers. Some say they had children together, sons who would inherit Lemnos and carry a mixed bloodline of Thessalian and Lemnian, of Aeolus and Thoas. Greek audiences liked that idea. It made the island feel connected to their own myths, gave those children a place in the tapestry. Time passed. Days blurred into weeks. The promised single night of hospitality lengthened as the crew of the Argo discovered how easy it was to let go of the urgency that had driven them from home. There were feasts, contests, and soft beds. Blades went unsharpened a little longer. Ropes went unchecked. The ship, beached and unloaded, began to feel like part of the scenery instead of a living thing. Not everyone was content. Heracles watched the change creep over the crew like rust. The same men who had once counted the days of the voyage now counted how many cups of wine they could drink. Voices that had spoken of Colchis and the fleece now spoke of which woman had the brightest eyes or the softest hands. The hero whose labors had torn him through half the known world felt a deep impatience rising in him. At last, in some versions, he took matters into his own hands. He hunted alone, bringing back less meat than before. He rose before the others, walked through the sleeping city, and stared at the Argo drawn up on the sand, her hull drying and cracking in the sun. One morning he simply lifted his club and brought it down hard against the side of the ship. The blow shuddered through the timbers. Men stumbled from doorways and from the arms of their Lemnian companions, as if the island itself had cried out. "Have you come here to found a town?" he roared to Jason and the others. "Or to finish a journey?" The words cut through wine and comfort. Coming from another man, they might have been brushed aside as jealousy or sourness. Coming from Heracles, whose whole life was a chain of impossible tasks, they carried a different weight. Orpheus, who had been singing more love songs than rowing chants of late, lowered his lyre. Tiphys looked toward the sea and saw not a barrier, but a road again. Jason knew shame when it sat down beside him. He had allowed himself to believe that the world would wait for him, that the fleece would hang in its grove forever, that Colchis would remain exactly as it was while he drowsed his days away with Hypsipyle. Heracles' anger stripped that illusion from him as cleanly as a butcher strips skin from a carcass. He went to Hypsipyle and told her that they must leave. The Queen of Lemnos did not beg him to stay. She had never been a child in this story. She had already killed once to secure her people's future. She looked at the man who had shared her bed and saw what he was and what he was not. Jason was a prince with a quest, not a husband with a long patience. "Go then," she said. "Leave us what you have sown, if the gods bless it. Let our sons remember that their fathers were not cowards. When you tell this tale elsewhere, speak of us as more than a diversion." It was as close to a curse as she allowed herself. The Argonauts returned to the ship with steps that felt heavier than on the day they had arrived. Some of the Lemnian women watched from the walls with cold faces. Others wept openly. A few stood with hands on their swelling bellies, already bearing the next generation. The Argo slid back into the sea. Behind her, the island of Lemnos receded, taking its quiet, shared guilt with it. In later songs, the time there would be a parenthesis in the voyage, a strange pause full of love and blood, and the uneasy knowledge that sometimes the greatest danger to a quest is the sudden appearance of a life that might have been. The sea does not care for human drama. It greeted them the same way it had before, with swells that lifted the ship and dropped her again, with days of flat calm that left the oarsmen sweating and cursing under a sky as blank as a shield. They passed between islands where goats grazed, and fishermen stared at them with narrow eyes, too practical to envy such a noisy cargo. The land fell away. The coasts they knew gave way to more unfamiliar shores. At last they came to the land of the Dolionians, a people ruled by a young king named Cyzicus. His city stood near the narrow waters of the Propontis, the sea that lies between the Aegean and the Black Sea, a kind of waiting room before the true dangers of the Euxine began. Cyzicus came out himself to meet the strangers, flanked by his warriors. He was no older than Jason, perhaps younger. His face still carried the softness of youth that had not yet been carved into hardness by repeated grief. He welcomed the Argonauts with genuine warmth. Hospitality was a sacred law among Greeks and their neighbors, and Cyzicus understood that entertaining famous guests could raise his own name in the stories that would be told after his death. The Argonauts were feasted. Sacrifices to the gods were shared. Cyzicus asked Jason about his quest, about Iolcus, about Peleus. Jason in turn listened to the young king speak of his own small kingdom, of the tribes beyond his borders, of the threats that came not from dragons and curses but from hunger and resentful neighbors. For a brief, rare moment, the story held a peace that felt almost stable. The Argo was resupplied. Repairs were made. The men enjoyed the solid ground under their feet and the company of other warriors. Before the ship left, Cyzicus and Jason exchanged gifts in the proper ritual fashion. Spear for spear, cloak for cloak. When the Argo set out again, it did so under a sky that held only scattered, gentle clouds. Then the wind turned. Night fell sooner than expected, carried on the back of thick weather that rolled in from the sea. Clouds swallowed the stars. The shoreline, which had been a clear line by day, vanished into a black smear. Tiphys strained at the steering oar, calling orders to rowers who could see nothing beyond the reach of their own arms. Waves rose higher. Rain began to fall in cold sheets. The men rowed until their arms burned. They thought they were moving along the coast, passing the familiar harbor of Cyzicus and going on. In truth, the wind and current twisted their path. The Argo was shoved in a great curve, like a leaf in a whirlpool, back toward the same shore it had left only hours before. In the storm, thick, dark shapes appeared on the water. Boats, low and quick, filled with armed men. The Dolionians had seen sails appear on their horizon again, had heard the slap of oars, but could not see the flag or the shape of the ship. To them, it looked like a raid. Pirates were not uncommon in those waters. Bands of desperate men who lived by stealing cargo and selling crews into slavery. Alarms spread through the city. Men who had drunk with the Argonauts that afternoon now grabbed spears and rushed to meet what they thought was a new threat. On the Argo, the same fear took hold. Tiphys saw the approaching craft and cursed. The oarsmen grabbed spears. The heroes rushed to the rail. No one recognized the outline of the harbor through the sheets of rain. No one recognized the voices on the other boats. Words were lost in the roar of the storm. What followed was short and ugly. The Dolionians attacked, believing they were defending their home. The Argonauts fought back, believing they were being ambushed by unknown enemies. The sea rocked both sides, turning footing treacherous, sending strikes wide and making shields slip. Heracles crushed a man's skull with his club and never knew whose son he was. Castor and Polydeuces fought side by side, thinking they were earning more fame, not carving sorrow into the history of a friendly shore. Jason himself met a warrior face to face in the flickering light of lightning. The man lunged. Jason parried, pushed, felt his own blade slide in under the other man's ribs. They were close enough that he could smell the man's breath. For a moment their eyes met. There was a flash of recognition there, not of the face, but of the type. This was no raider. This was a king. By the time the fighting stopped and the storm began to tire, bodies floated in the shallows. Others lay twisted on the sand where waves already tugged at their feet. The sky slowly tore itself open just enough to let starlight through. Shapes became clearer. Voices, now that they were not screaming, could be heard properly. Someone shouted Cyzicus' name. Someone else shouted Jason. The truth struck like another blow. They had killed their host. Jason stood over the body of King Cyzicus, the same young man who had given him a cloak and a spear that morning. Blood stained the sand around him, mixing with rain and seawater. The Argonauts who had survived stared in horrified silence. The Doleonians who still lived held their weapons with hands that shook from rage and grief. No god appeared to explain. No voice from Dodona spoke up to say that this was fate. This was human error and human consequence, tangled in a way that no one present could easily forgive or forget. There are different endings to this episode in the old tales. In some, the Doleonians, recognizing that the Argonauts had thought they were under attack, allowed them to live. Together they held a funeral for Cyzicus. They built a great mound over his body and held games in his honor, with wrestling and racing and contests of strength that seemed bitter consolation for a life cut short. In other versions, the grief of the Doleonians could not bear the sight of the ship that had brought this ruin, and they drove the Argonauts away as soon as the storm passed. Either way, the stain of the night remained. Jason and his men had shed innocent blood not through malice, but through confusion and fear. That did not make the ground any less soaked. Greek audiences understood the weight of such acts. In a world where hospitality was sacred, killing a host was a crime that clung to the soul. The Argo left the shore of the Doleonians in a silence heavy enough to press on the chest. No one boasted. Orpheus sang a slow song for the dead, his fingers moving gently on the strings. Idmon sat with his eyes closed, seeing futures that now had to grow around a new trunk of guilt. Jason stood at the prow and stared ahead, knowing that the voyage was no longer a clean line between departure and prize. It had already become something darker. Somewhere beyond the next headland waited another loss, the story of Hylas and the pool. Heracles, who had roused them from their long sleep on Lemnos, would soon learn how quickly the sea can take what a man loves. But that belongs to the next turning of the oars. The sea does not pause to let men grieve properly. It simply keeps breathing under the hull, lifting and dropping, as if nothing at all has changed. The Argo left the morning shore of Cyzicus behind, with her oars moving in a slow, exhausted rhythm. The faces of the crew were set and inward. Even Heracles grew quiet. The only conversation was the slap of water and the occasional low murmur from Tiphys as he spoke to the steering oar, coaxing the ship along the coast of Mysia. They found a bay there that looked harmless enough, a curve of beach, a rim of trees, a stream that came down from the hills with the clear, restless voice that every sailor longs to hear after too many days of brine. Tiphys judged it safe. The anchor was dropped. Some of the men went into the woods for firewood. Others remained to tend the ship. Heracles, sweating under the weight of his own strength and his lion's skin, sent Hylas for water. Hylas was not a hero in the way that bards usually mean. He had no famous parentage beyond a vague story that named a father killed by raiders. Heracles had taken him in, given him a place at his side, and the boy had grown into that role with the shy pride of someone who has one foot in the world of ordinary men and one toe in the realm of legends. He was strong enough to haul ropes, agile enough to run errands, pretty enough that even men noticed when his face turned toward the light. He took a bronze pitcher and walked inland, following the sound of the stream. The evening was coming on, the air cooling, the trees smelling of resin and earth. Somewhere an owl called once, then fell silent. Hylas pushed through a screen of low branches and found a small pool fed by the spring. The surface was as smooth as polished dark stone. He bent to fill the pitcher, and the water broke. Nymphs lived in that pool. Dryads inhabited trees, Oreads mountains, and Naiads streams and springs. These were Naiads, daughters of fresh water, with pale arms and hair that clung like weed. They saw the boy bending over their home, and, being what they were, they fell in love with him in an instant. Love is a gentle word. Desire is more accurate. They wanted him. They wanted the warmth of his skin in their cold element, the sound of his breath under the surface, a living ornament to coil around like reeds. They seized his arm from beneath the water with a grip stronger than he expected, and before he could cry out properly, they pulled him in. The pool closed over his head with barely a ripple. On the shore, the bronze pitcher rolled once and lay still, spilling a thin line of water into the soil. Heracles waited by the fire as the sun slid down the sky. He was not an easy man to keep waiting. The embers had burned low by the time he rose to his feet and stalked into the woods, calling Hylas' name. Birds scattered before him. Trees seemed to lean aside. He found the pool. He found the empty cup. He did not find the boy. The roar that tore from his throat then frightened even the night birds. He crashed through the undergrowth, ripping branches free with his hands, ripping at the earth as if he could dig the boy out from under the roots by force. The nymphs had what they wanted. They were not going to give him back. Hylas, in some versions, lived on beneath the water, loved and cherished, never aging. That was a comfort for storytellers, and almost none at all for Heracles. While he tore the forest apart, the wind shifted on the bay. The men on the Argo called his name. No answer came. The sky darkened further. Tiphys, who understood the moods of weather and sea better than any, saw that they were about to be pinned to the shore by bad conditions. Staying would mean being trapped, perhaps wrecked. Leaving meant abandoning Heracles and the boy. The sources disagree on how the decision was made. Some blame Tiphys and the other sailors, saying that they weighed one hero against an entire crew and chose the crew. Others whisper that Hera herself, who had taken Jason as her particular favorite, arranged matters so that Heracles would be left behind. The son of Zeus drew too much attention wherever he went. If Jason was to grow into anything greater than a name on a passenger list, the shadow of Heracles had to fall elsewhere. In the end, the Argo left Mysia without him. Heracles remained on the shore with the woods behind him and the empty pool before him. His grief would turn inward and outward both, into new labors and new furies. The Argo, which had once been a gathering of almost every famous name in Greek story, grew a little emptier and a little more focused. They rowed on. Beyond Mysia, lay the land of the Bebryces, a rough people who had carved out their claim on the coast with fists and clubs. Their king, Amycus, was a giant of a man by mortal standards. He was not a creature of divine blood in most tellings, only a human who had found joy in his own brutal strength. Amycus had a habit. Any stranger who came to his country by sea was forced to face him in a boxing match. No one had yet survived. When the Argo anchored near his land, Amycus appeared on the shore, pounding his fists together, issuing the usual challenge. His eyes went from face to face as the Argonauts gathered. He saw Jason and dismissed him. He saw Tiphys and Orpheus and sneered. Then his gaze stopped on Polydeuces, one of the Dioscuri, whose hands were wrapped in strips of leather, whose shoulders and arms carried the particular way of moving that belongs to trained fighters. The match that followed was the kind of thing later storytellers loved to linger over. Two men in a circle, no weapons, only bone and skin, and the willingness to walk through pain. Amycus swung like a man who had never needed to worry about defense. Polydeuces moved like a man who had trained under Spartan discipline, who knew that timing could topple giants. In the end, Amycus lay dead or broken, depending on the version, and the Bebryces found themselves suddenly free of a ruler who had always looked a little too pleased by the sight of blood on sand. The Argonauts left them to sort out their own politics and pressed on. These side tales were like small waves breaking against the greater swell of the quest. Interesting, dangerous, but not the main storm. That waited further along the coast of Thrace. Salmydessus was a sour place. The city crouched on a promontory above a rocky shore where shipwrecks were common. The locals had gained a dark reputation as wreckers, men who would stand on the cliffs in bad weather, watching for the breaking of foreign hulls, then scramble down to strip the dead. The sea there was treacherous. Shifting currents, sudden shallows. It was a natural place for a man like Phineus to end his story. Phineus had once been a king of that region and a prophet favored by Apollo. In some traditions, he was the son of Argonauts. In others, a child of Poseidon himself, which would mean the sea god had another reason to be present in this narrative. At some point in his life, Phineus crossed a line that prophets are always in danger of crossing. He told too much. Gods like supplicants who come to them with questions. That is part of how worship works. Mortals ask, gods withhold or grant, and in that unequal exchange lies devotion. A prophet who answers every question clearly, who reveals the shape of the future without mystery, threatens that balance. People might turn to him instead of to the gods. Zeus, who never enjoyed competition, punished Phineus. In many versions, the punishment was a double curse. Phineus was struck blind, and he was given to the Harpies. Blindness in Greek myth is not just inability to see. It is a symbol of knowledge turned inward. Tiresias, that other great seer, is blind and yet sees more than most. For Phineus, sightless eyes were only part of his torment. The Harpies completed the design. Harpies were storm spirits given flesh. Their name comes from a root that means snatch or seize. Artists later showed them as women from the waist up and birds from the waist down, with wings and talons and faces twisted by hunger and spite. Their smell was said to be worse than rotting meat left out in summer. Their voices were shrill, half human curses and half the scream of tearing wind. They did not kill Phineas. That would have been too simple. They waited for him each day when food was brought to his table. As soon as he reached out his hands, they darted in. They snatched most of the food away in their claws and beaks, and what they did not take, they fouled with their own filth. Bread was smeared with excrement. Meat grew slimy under their touch. The old man was left with scraps, hardly enough to keep a body alive. By the time the Argo arrived at Salmydessus, Phineas was a figure from a Stephen King town long before such towns existed. Thin to the point of transparency, skin like parchment draped over bone, eyes clouded, staring at a world he could still describe in detail, but not see. He lived in a house that stank of fear and old curses. The Argonauts came to him cautiously. It is one thing to face a monster with teeth and claws. It is another to speak with a man who has been sitting under divine punishment for years. Some gods are jealous of their work. Phineas, for his part, knew they were coming. Prophecy had not been taken from him. It had merely been turned into a source of misery. He greeted Jason by name before the hero could speak, which did nothing to make the crew feel more at ease. Yet when food was brought for the guests, as well as for the blind king, the harpies appeared as they always did. They did not care for etiquette. They came out of the air in a scream and a rush of wings, talons scraping wood, the stench of them like a physical blow. They went first for Phineas' plate, as usual, scattering scraps, defecating on the table, then turned to the other dishes, delighted to find more to ruin. Men reached for weapons, but could not quite bring themselves to stab God's servants. Two of the Argonauts did not hesitate. Zetes and Calais, the sons of Boreas, had been watching Phineas with a particular attention. There was an old connection here. In one tradition, the blind king had once been married to their sister Cleopatra, then had been tricked into blinding their nephews at the urging of a new wife. In another, the bond was between wind and storm, between air and the creatures that travel through it. Whichever version the old storytellers favored, the effect was the same. The sight of the harpies tormenting the old man stirred something in the brothers that had more iron in it than pity. When the harpies swooped down, Zetes and Calais leaped up. Their shoulders burst into motion, the feathers there unfurling like sudden cloaks. They took to the air after the monsters, each beat of their wings scattering dust and straw from the floor. The chase that followed was a legend in its own right. Over the sea and along the coast, the four figures flew, a knot of hatred and fury tearing across the sky. The harpies shrieked and darted, their bodies built for sudden plunges, not for sustained flight. The sons of Boreas, bred for the long, cold winds of the north, kept after them, their faces set, their eyes burning. Some say Zetes and Calais caught the harpies over the islands, later called the Strophades, which means turning islands, because that was where they turned back. In those accounts, the winged brothers killed the storm spirits, cutting them down out of the air, and their bodies fell into the sea to rot. Other sources, kinder or more pious, say that the goddess Iris appeared before the chase could end in blood. Iris, the rainbow, messenger of gods, shone across the sky like a bridge between storm and calm. She begged the sons of Boreas to spare the Harpies, promising that they would trouble Phineus no more. In return, the brothers swore not to pursue them further. The Harpies fled to a remote cave and stayed there, living on offerings meant for other deities, sulking in their stench. However, the details played out when Zetes and Calais returned to Salmydessus. The air in Phineus' house was different. No shriek split the silence when food was brought. No foul wind swept through the room. For the first time in years, the blind man reached out his hands and found bread and meat that stayed where they were supposed to be. Gratitude in such a man was not a polite thing. It was raw and heavy. Phineus bowed his head, the thin skin on his neck creasing like old parchment, and promised the Argonauts what he had left to give: knowledge. He told them of the Symplegades. He ordered the crew to prepare a dove. There was such a bird on board. Sailors carried them for messages and omens. Its feathers were white, streaked with grey, its eyes bright and restless. Jason held it for a moment in his hands, feeling the rapid beat of its heart under his fingers. Then he lifted his arm and released it toward the chasm. For a breath, nothing moved. Then the dove shot forward, wings flickering, a scrap of living softness against stone that had stood there since the earth cooled. The Symplegades seemed almost to pause, as if curious. Then they began to lean toward each other. The men on the Argo held their breath. The birds streaked between the cliffs just as they slammed together. Stone met stone with a sound like the breaking of mountains. Spray leaped up, raining down in a cold curtain. For a moment, there was no sign of the dove. Then it burst out on the far side, flapping hard, a few tail feathers sheared away by the closing rock. It fluttered in clumsy circles before finding calmer air and finally settled, shivering, on the top of the mast of the waiting ship. The omen was clear enough. Jason drew in a lungful of salty air and shouted for the men to their oars. "Now," he called, "all together. Row as if you mean to break the sea itself." The benches filled, muscles bunched. Orpheus struck a heavy, urgent rhythm, his music falling into the marrow of every man on board. Tiphys set the steering oar and fixed his gaze on the gap between the cliffs. The Argo surged forward. The Symplegades, having just closed, began to drift apart again. The space between them widened, showing a channel of frothing water that led to the deeper calm beyond. The ship drove into that gap, the oars biting, the hull trembling. Water leaped up over the gunwales, drenching faces, but no one slowed. As the Argo reached the center, the cliffs began to move inward once more. Their shadow fell across the decks like the lowering of a lid. Men cried out but did not stop pulling. Tiphys leaned his whole weight into the steering, coaxing the prow along the exact line of least danger. There is a moment in every story when effort is not enough, when the gap between success and failure is too large for human hands to bridge. In that heartbeat, Athena moved. She was there in the form of a cry that no one on board could quite hear, in the sudden lift of a wave under the stern, in the way the prow of the Argo seemed to leap just a little farther than momentum could explain. The sacred beam from Dodona groaned, as if in answer, its own memory of the voice of Zeus, rising in its grain. The cliffs slammed together again. The Argo slipped through with the sound of scraping wood and shrieking stone. The stern was caught a glancing blow. Carved ornaments splintered and fell into the churning water. For a few terrifying heartbeats, the ship seemed pinned. Then the force of the rowers and the lift of the sea wrenched her free, sending her lurching into the wider calm beyond. Behind her, the Symplegades met one final time, and then, as Phineas had promised, froze. The age of moving cliffs ended. Sailors who came after would still face currents and storms and monsters of their own, but the living gate of rock was now just another piece of coastline. The Argonauts had changed the world in a small, permanent way. They did not stop to admire their work. The Black Sea lay spread before them, its reputation pressing on their minds. The old name for it, the Inhospitable Sea, seemed more fitting in that first grey light. The air felt heavier. The wind carried smells from distant, unfamiliar lands. The Argo sailed on, her hull scarred, her crew thinned and hardened. Her prow pointed toward a kingdom at the far edge of Greek imagination, where a king of the blood of the sun ruled and a woman named Medea was beginning to dream uneasy dreams. The Black Sea spread around them like a great dark bowl. To later Greek sailors, it would become a familiar inland water, ringed with colonies and trading posts. In Jason's day, it was closer to a rumor-given shape. The early name for it, the Inhospitable Sea, carried stories of sudden tempests, barbarian tribes, and shores where strangers were not greeted with bread and salt, but with ropes and blades. The Argo moved across it as a small bright thing on a sullen surface, her hull scarred, her crew already carrying fresh ghosts. Now they were heading toward a place that was less a location than an edge of the map, Colchis. The poets placed Colchis at the easternmost reach of the sea, at the mouth of the river Phasis. In the world that would later be called Georgia, archaeologists would one day find traces of real kingdoms that lived and died on those fertile river plains, rich in metals and timber. Greek traders would learn that local people washed river sand through fleeces to catch particles of gold, hanging the sodden wool up to dry with its captured glitter. From such practical work, the story of a golden fleece hanging in a sacred grove may have grown, its mundane origin clothed in divine adventure. Jason and his crew knew none of that. For them, Colchis was a word that tasted of distance and peril, a land at the far end of everything. Nights on the Black Sea were different. The constellations were the same, but the air had a particular cool clarity that made them feel closer, as if the sky were leaning down to listen. Idmon would sit by the mast and trace paths among the stars with a blind man's certainty, naming not only the familiar shapes but the routes he thought the gods might take among them. Sometimes he fell silent mid-sentence, as if he had just stepped on the edge of a vision he preferred not to share. They passed coasts where local tribes watched from the tree line, narrow-eyed and silent, spears in hand. They skirted the lands of the Amazons, the warrior women who lived by the river Thermodon. Those women had their own stories of gods and horses and the founding of cities, but there was no time to anchor and trade tales. The Argo pressed on, an intrusion from the south that would later give rise to half-remembered accounts in local songs about the time a foreign ship with a speaking prow cut through their waters. One morning the wind came from the east with the smell of damp earth and distant fires. Tiphys, who had learned to listen not only to waves but to the air itself, straightened at the steering oar. He pointed ahead, where a faint line was beginning to show on the horizon. Not just any line. A broad, low band of green, darker than the bare cliffs they had grown used to. As they drew closer, they saw the river, wide and brown, pouring itself into the sea. On its banks rose buildings of timber and stone, and above them the hill of a palace. Aea, the city of Aeetes. King Aeetes was not simply another mortal with too much land and not enough friends. His blood ran warm with sunlight. He was a son of Helios, the sun, and a brother to women whose names were already darker than most kings. Circe, who dwelt on her own island, turning visitors into animals when they displeased her. Pasiphae, queen of Crete, whose union with a sacred bull had produced the Minotaur, a horror that dwelt at the center of a maze. Aeetes himself had once ruled in Corinth in some stories, before moving eastward to this new domain. The family of the sun was fond of places that lay at the edge of things. Under Aeetes' rule, Colchis had become a place of iron and ritual. The fields near the river were green, but behind them rose forests that had been cut and regrown many times, scarred by the needs of shipbuilding and war. The people of Colchis were not Greeks. Their language was harsh and strange to Jason's ears. Their clothing was brighter, full of deep reds and patterned fabrics that caught the eye. Some wore caps of fur. Their swords were curved rather than straight, meant more for cutting and slashing than for the clean thrust preferred in the cities of the Aegean. Most impressive of all were the chariots that rattled through the streets near the palace. They were not the light racing chariots of later games, but heavier platforms drawn by spirited horses, useful for intimidation as much as battle. The air around the city carried the smell of sacrifice, of burnt offerings to gods that Jason did not know by name. Yet one thing here was familiar: the presence of fear in the hearts of ordinary people when their king's name was spoken. The golden fleece hung not within the palace, but in a sacred grove outside the city, near the river. That grove was old even then. Trees with trunks thick as towers rose there, their branches twisted by age and constant wind. At the center of the grove stood the oak where the fleece was draped, its wool gleaming with a dull, constant light even in shade, as if it contained a piece of daylight stolen and pinned to bark. Wound around the tree at its roots and trunk coiled a serpent that never slept. In Greek, the word used for such creatures slides between snake and dragon. This guardian was both. Scales like overlapping bronze, eyes that reflected torchlight without blinking, breath that carried the cold, dry smell of stone cellars and deep caves. Some said this dragon was born from the teeth of Typhon, or of other primeval monsters. Others said Aeetes had raised it from a hatchling, feeding it on raw meat and the hearts of trespassers. No ordinary thief could hope to come within reach of that tree and live. The Argonauts anchored the Argo near the mouth of the river and advanced inland with care. Even the boldest among them felt the weight of this place. They were far from every familiar shoreline, surrounded by people whose gods might not look kindly on strangers at their shrines. The rough joking that had carried them through earlier landings faded into a grave quiet. Jason sent heralds first, as protocol demanded. They bore olive branches as a sign of peace, and gifts in the Greek style. Fine cloth woven in Iolcus, worked bronze, a drinking cup with scenes of centaurs and hunters chasing each other in endless motion. These men were brought under guard to Aeetes' palace, where word of these visitors reached the ear of the king. The main hall of the palace in Aea was not so different from those Jason had seen at home, yet the differences mattered. The roof beams were carved with images of chariots and blazing suns. The hearth was bigger, the smoke hole wider. The walls were hung not with tapestries of battles between Greeks and their neighbors, but with scenes of chariot hunts and foreign beasts, of men in tall caps making offerings to long-armed, strange-faced gods. The air smelled of resin, wine, and the faint iron smell of blood soaking into earth. On a high seat at the far end sat Aeetes. His hair was streaked with grey, but his skin held a faint, persistent warmth, as if some inner light had sunburned him and never quite faded. His eyes were narrow and watchful. When he spoke, his voice carried the accent of Colchis, and a translator relayed his words to Jason in Greek, but there was nothing confused in those dark eyes. He understood ships and swords and men who came from far away asking for what was his. Jason introduced himself formally. Son of Aeson, Prince of Iolcus, leader of the Argonauts. He listed the names of his companions, knowing that some of them would surely carry weight even here. Heracles had left them, but Orpheus stood by his side, and the Dioscuri, and others. He explained the quest further, the prophecy, the promise of Peleus, the long voyage. It was a strange thing to lay before a foreign king. I have come because my uncle fears me. I have traveled half the world to take a treasure that was given to your keeping. I have no claim in your law, only in my own need. Aeetes listened without interruption. When the speech ended, he sat in silence for a moment, then smiled in a way that showed nothing of his thoughts. So the Greeks send their finest to demand gifts in the name of their own quarrels, he said through the translator. It is an old story. Your fathers did the same in other lands. You come to me because you believe that you have gods on your side. So do I. There was a murmur among the court at this. The men of Colchis, gathered around their king, eyed the Argonauts with a mix of curiosity and irritation. Some picked out individual Greeks and judged their armor, their height, their scars. Betting on how they might fare if it came to blows would have been easy sport if there had not been a sense that something larger than a stray duel was at stake. Aeetes could have refused outright. He could have ordered his guards to cut Jason down in the hall and hang the bodies of his men on the city walls. But kings who do that risk calling down divine anger too quickly. Zeus liked to see a little show first. Tricks, tests. You shall not say that Aeetes denied you honor, the king went on. I will not give you the fleece for nothing. That would be an insult to the gods who placed it in my charge, but I will give you an opportunity to prove that they favor you. If you complete the tasks I set, you may take the fleece and leave with my blessing." Jason felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The hall seemed to grow warmer. He bowed his head, because that was what a guest was supposed to do. But inside he was measuring the possibilities. In stories, kings who set tasks never choose easy ones. Aeetes outlined the first. "In my fields there are 2 bulls that your countrymen have not seen the like of," he said. "Hephaestus forged them. Their hooves are bronze, their breath is fire. No one in Colchis dares to yoke them. You will do so. You will take the plow and drag it across a certain field at the edge of the city. Only when the earth there has been turned will the first part of your request be considered." There was a stir among the Argonauts. Even men like Heracles might have thought twice about wrestling beasts breathed from the forge of Hephaestus. Jason felt sweat prickle under his armor. He kept his voice steady. "And when that is done, Lord," he asked, "will the fleece be ours?" Aeetes shook his head. "No, that field, once plowed, will receive seed that is no seed. I will give you a sack of dragon's teeth. Each one, when sown, will grow into an armed warrior. You will face the crop you plant and live. Only then will we speak of the fleece." Dragon teeth. Jason had heard of such magic. In older tales, the hero Cadmus had killed a dragon sacred to Ares and planted its teeth on the plain. From them rose the Spartoi, the sown men, who killed each other until only a handful remained. Those few became the ancestors of noble houses in Thebes. That was back in the world of central Greece. Here, at the far edge of the sea, the same grim trick seemed ready to sprout again. The Argonauts murmured among themselves. Some, like the Dioscuri, reached for the comfort of spear and shield. Others thought more quietly, wondering what exactly grew in such soil. Orpheus watched Jason. Idmon looked not at the king, but at the air above his head, where futures tangled. Aeetes leaned back on his throne, satisfied. It was an elegant solution. He could appear generous while setting tasks that would almost certainly kill the foreigner. Before the question of the fleece ever reached the sacred grove, the gods could watch without feeling cheated of a spectacle. The people could whisper about the daring of the strangers and the cunning of their king. There was another pair of eyes on Jason as well. At the edge of the hall, half in shadow, stood a young woman with dark, heavy hair and a face that did not yet know how to be unreadable. Her dress was of Colchian cut, but at her belt hung small bags of herbs and tools that belonged more to shrines than to drawing rooms. Bracelets glinted at her wrists, carved with symbols not Greek but older, from the deep corners of remembered night. This was Medea, daughter of Aeetes, granddaughter of Helios, niece of Circe and Pasiphae, priestess of Hecate, goddess of crossroads and witch fires and the presence that lingers where fields give way to wilderness. She had grown up in a world where the natural and the supernatural were not separate realms. Herbs whispered their names to her fingers. The phases of the moon were as important as the changing of the seasons. Old women taught her chants that had nothing to do with the polite hymns sung in public temples. She knew what roots to grind to stop a heart without leaving a mark. She knew what to burn to make a lost man wander in circles until dawn. More than that, she knew her father. She saw Jason standing there with his sea-roughened cloak and his sword polished despite the long journey. And she understood the shape of this story with a clarity that made her feel ill. Aeetes had no intention of letting this stranger live long enough to touch the golden fleece. The tasks were a veil. Behind them lay plans for a quiet grave outside the city for any hero foolish enough to try. In older versions of the myth, she might have watched with only intellectual interest, a sorceress evaluating a new ingredient in the cauldron of her life. But the gods were not content with that. Hera, who hated Peleus and had chosen Jason as her instrument, and Athena, who favored cleverness in all things, knew that their chosen mortal could not win by brute strength. They needed Colchis itself to turn on its own king. So they turned, as gods often did when they desired subtlety, to Aphrodite. The goddess of love and its many misuses did not need much convincing. She sent her son Eros, who in older tales was not a plump child, but a sharp-faced, restless youth with a quiver of arrows that never missed. He slipped into the hall of Aeetes like a draught, invisible to all but his mother and the sisters who watched the spinning of fates. While Jason was still speaking, while Medea still stood half in shadow, Eros drew an arrow. The point glittered with a light no human eye could quite see. He aimed without hesitation and let it fly. It struck Medea in the heart. She started as if someone had touched her with a hot iron. Her breath left her. For a moment the hall blurred, and only one figure remained clear. Jason, the stranger from the sea, the man whom her father meant to kill, the man whom the gods had just tied to her soul with a thread that would never fully break, only twist and knot and strangle. Medea gripped the charms at her belt with fingers that trembled in a way they never had before. She did not fall into the softness of the love stories that girls in gentler lands told each other. The feeling that flooded her was fiercer and more complicated. It was desire, pity, anger at her father, a sudden, sharp longing for escape, and a recognition of something fragile and doomed. For the first time, Jason felt the weight of Colchis not as a distant problem, but as a trap that had already started to close. He bowed to Aeetes, accepted the terms of the tasks with as much dignity as he could muster, and stepped back among his men. Behind him, in the crowd, a pair of dark eyes watched him with an intensity that seemed to burn through stone. Somewhere far away, on an island where Circe listened to the wind, and on a throne in the sky where Helios drove the sun, members of Medea's family paused in what they were doing and turned their attention east. Night came down over Aea. Fires burned in the courtyards. The serpent in the grove shifted its coils around the tree where the fleece glowed faintly in the dark. In her chamber, Medea lay awake, smelling herbs that she had crushed with her own hands, listening to the faint whisper of a foreign sea in the distance and the louder whisper of a god's arrow buried in her chest. Medea did not sleep. She walked the narrow circuit of her chamber until the rush mat complained under her feet. Outside, the palace of Aea settled into its night sounds, guards calling to each other on the walls, horses shifting in their stalls, the distant hiss of the river. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of herbs and old smoke. On a low table lay the tools of her work: bronze knives, pestles stained green and black, little jars of powder that could cure or kill depending on the word spoken with them. Her father had given his decree. At dawn, Jason would face the bulls. By noon, he would be dead. By evening, his ship would be stripped for timber and his crew either buried or enslaved. Aeetes would stand before the people and say that the gods had judged the foreigner unworthy. The story would close as neatly as a scroll. Medea ground the pestle into the mortar until her arm ached. Hecate did not appear in a flash of light. That was not her way. The goddess of doors and borders spoke in subtler forms, in the way a flame leans when there is no wind, in the taste of iron on the tongue when no blood has been spilled. Medea felt that presence now, a watchfulness at the edge of her thoughts. She knew the rites. She had stood at triple crossroads at midnight, with a torch in her hand and offerings at her feet, calling to the one who heard the voices that other gods ignored. She gathered roots that had drunk moonlight, a scrap of an old serpent skin, drops of dark resin from trees that grew near graves. She sang as she mixed them, low and steady, a song that wound through 3 languages, one of them older than the palace itself. The ointment that rose in the bowl was thick and glistening, with a smell like earth and metal and a hint of lightning. When she was done, she wrapped the bowl and slipped from her chamber like a shadow that had decided to walk on its own. She found Jason waiting in the dim court where the torches smoked and the guards looked away. His face was drawn. He had seen enough of the world to know that courage alone would not keep a man standing in front of the bulls of Hephaestus. Still, he did not flinch when she approached. "You will die in that field if you go as you are," Medea said, without preamble. "My father does not intend to honor any bargain. He wants to see you burned." Jason did not reach for her hand. He was not a courtly lover. He stood as a man who has been told the diagnosis he expected and is listening for any last remedy. "Then tell me how not to die," he said. She held out the bowl. "Smear this on your skin and shield, on your spear and helmet. At sunrise, it will turn the flame for a day. The bulls will scorch the ground, but not you. When the dragon men rise from the earth, do not meet them as a line of soldiers. Throw a stone among them. They will think it came from one of their own and fall on each other. When the last man stands, you may kill him easily." "What price do you ask?" Jason said at once. No one gave such gifts without cost. Not in Colchis, not in Iolcus, not in the halls of any king. Medea swallowed. The arrow of Eros twisted in her chest. Behind it, the colder logic of her own mind spoke. If she helped him, she betrayed her father and her people. If she did nothing, she would watch him die and live out her days in a palace that had become a prison. "Swear by Zeus and by your own house that you will take me with you," she said. "Swear that you will make me your wife in a land far from here. Swear it on the fleece you seek." Jason hesitated only a breath. "The future is always cheapest at midnight," he swore. He called the names of gods who were listening very closely. He took the bowl from her hands, and their fingers brushed. The touch shocked them both more than the ritual words. Dawn came red over the fields of Colchis. The bulls were already there when Jason arrived, snorting steam. Their hides shone like beaten bronze. Sparks fell from their hooves when they struck the packed earth. When they bellowed, their breath roared out as fire, grass curling black in an instant. They were the work of Hephaestus, the same maker whose hands had shaped the sickle of Cronus and the chains of Prometheus. These beasts were not meant as farm tools. They were meant as instruments of terror. Jason walked toward them with Medea's ointment on his skin and weapons. The salve burned cold where it touched. For a moment, he wondered if she had tricked him, if his flesh would peel under the first breath. Then the nearest bull turned, eyes red, and charged. The fire hit him like a wall. It should have cooked him inside his armor. Instead, it wrapped around him and slid off, held at bay by whatever names Medea had whispered over that bowl. The heat of it still made his teeth ache, but his skin did not blister. He grabbed the horn of the beast, feeling the shock of force run up his arm, and heaved. Wrestling a creation of a god is not like wrestling any animal born from a common womb. The bull fought like a living furnace. Jason's muscles screamed. For a long breath, it could have gone either way. Then the ointment on his hands seemed to bite into the polished horn, giving him grip, and he forced the head down. The yoke crashed over the neck. The other bull lurched into place at its side. The onlookers shouted, some in fear, some in a kind of unwilling admiration. Aeetes watched from his chariot, face unreadable. Jason took the plow and dragged it across the cursed field, iron biting into earth that had never been tilled. When the furrows were ready, Aeetes' men brought the sack of teeth, white, sharp, each one the last remnant of some ancient dragon. They clinked like small bones as they fell into Jason's hand. He sowed them in the dark earth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the soil began to heave. Fingers gripped the surface from below. Helms broke through, then shoulders, then entire warriors shouldering their way up out of the ground, each fully armed, each born with rage already in his eyes. A crop of men, sown for slaughter. Jason stepped back, remembering Medea's words. He picked up a heavy rock, rough and ordinary, and hurled it into the midst of the advancing line. It struck a bronze shield with a ringing crack. The nearest earth-born soldier turned, thinking himself attacked. He struck his neighbor. That neighbor roared and struck back. In a heartbeat, the whole line broke into sudden chaos. Each man convinced the blow had come from the one beside him. Spears thrust, swords hacked. The field became a grinding mill of armor and blood. When it was done, only a few stood, staggering and wounded. Jason moved among them with a cold efficiency he had not known he possessed, cutting them down before they could realize what had happened. He stood alone on the torn field, dust and the stink of hot metal on the air, and looked back toward the city. He had done the impossible, twice. Yet he could see in the set of Aeetes' shoulders that the king was not thinking of keeping any promises. That night, the sacred grove waited. The dragon coiled around the tree, the fleece hanging like trapped dawn in the branches. Medea, with her hair unbound and a torch in her hand, walked toward it, Jason at her side. They went to the grove at the hour when fires burn low and even guards grow careless. Medea walked before Jason with a torch that smoked green at the edges, its light the color of things buried too long. The trees there were older than the palace, older than the walls. At their center, the oak of the fleece rose, and around its trunk the dragon lay coiled like a living length of night, eyes open and without mercy. Medea called softly to powers that did not belong to Olympus. She mixed honey with poppy and bitter roots, poured it in a dark line before the serpent, and sang. Hecate was in her voice. Sleep came to the dragon in heavy waves. The great head sagged, the coils loosened. Jason climbed past that ancient body, hands scraping bark, and touched the golden fleece at last. It was heavier than he expected, warm, as if it still remembered the living ram and the sun god who had once sent it across the sky. When he flung it over his shoulder, the wool shone in the dark like a small, tamed dawn. Together, they ran for the river. The Argo waited with oars ready, the crew already braced for trouble. Trouble came quickly. Aeetes woke to an empty bed where his daughter should have slept, and to guards babbling of foreign thieves. He launched his ships in pursuit. In some tales he sent with them Apsyrtus, Medea's young brother. In others the boy had already sailed with his sister, trusting her more than the king. Either way, the end was the same. Cornered on an island or in a narrow inlet, Jason and Medea chose a path that even gods spoke of with distaste. They lured Apsyrtus into parley and killed him, Prince's blood soaking strange sand. In the cruelest version, Medea cut the body into pieces and dropped them into the sea, one by one. Aeetes behind them was forced to slow, gathering the limbs of his son for burial, while the Argo fled on with the fleece and the witch who had betrayed her house. From there the route tangled like bad thread. Some said the Argo was blown far north into rivers that led toward the Danube and the cold lands, so that the ship seemed to circle the world before finding its way back to the known seas. Others had them turn south more quickly to seek cleansing. Murder of kin was not a stain that simple seawater could wash away. They came to the island of Circe, Medea's aunt, that curious half-divine woman who knew as much of herbs and binding spells as any living creature. There, beside fires that burned with colors not found in simple wood, Jason and Medea were purified in rites that smelled of blood and laurel. Circe scolded her niece for her crime and for her love, but there was pity in it. She knew too well what it was to live inside the schemes of gods. After that, the Argo brushed close to other famous coasts. They passed the Sirens, whose singing promised knowledge and delight. Orpheus outsang them, his lyre lifting over their calls, giving the rowers a safer tune to follow. Wax in ears could dull temptation. A stronger song could drown it. Near Crete, they found the bronze giant Talos, striding around the island 3 times each day. His body was cast metal, his single vein closed at the ankle with a bronze nail. He hurled stones at passing ships, a one-man fortress. Medea brought him down not with spear or club, but with words and knowing. In some stories, she promised him immortality if he would remove the nail himself. In others, she drove him mad with a glance. Either way, the plug came free. The ichor that was his life gushed out, and he toppled, shaking the ground like a falling tower. At last Thessaly rose on the horizon, familiar hills and coasts that seemed smaller now than when they had left. The Argo returned to Iolcus with the golden fleece blazing on her prow, and Medea standing beside Jason, foreign and unsettling. A living pledge that the gods had meddled deeply in this voyage. Peleus saw the ship and knew at once that his elegant solution had failed. Jason lived. Worse, he had succeeded. The usurper refused the throne he had promised. Kings who gain power through blood seldom surrender it for the sake of oaths made in public wine. Medea stepped into that breach, as if into a role prepared for her from birth. She showed the daughters of Peleus a marvel. "Cut up an old ram," she said, "boil it with these herbs, and see it leap from the cauldron as a lamb again." They watched flesh knit and wool whiten and believed. In their hunger to restore their father's youth, they copied the trick on him, knives rising and falling in a frenzy of piety. This time the cauldron remained only a black mouth, full of steam and meat. Peleus died by the hands of his own daughters, and the city of Iolcus filled with a choking silence that was not quite grief. Yet even that bloody gift did not give Jason his throne. The people, horrified, drove him and Medea out. They went into exile once more, to Corinth this time, where new palaces and new promises waited. The fleece, that shining prize, faded into the background, hung in a shrine, its magic more political than divine now. The ship that had carried it, the Argo, was dedicated to Poseidon and left to age on shore until the wood dried and cracked, and Zeus sent a thunderbolt to finish her story. What remained were the people who had ridden her plank by plank into legend. Jason, restless and dissatisfied. Medea, dangerous and wounded. A woman whom the gods had used and who would, in time, decide to answer them in kind. The voyage of the Argonauts was over, but the ruin it set in motion had only begun to move.